This webinar is a recording of the presentation delivered at the primary Xavier INSET on the 7th of October 2022 on supporting children with literacy difficulties in the classroom. This training is suitable for any teachers or support staff working with primary age children. If you're a parent wanting to understand more about literacy difficulties, dyslexia and how to support your child at home, you may find the webinar titled "Does My Child Have Dyslexia?" more helpful. In this session, we will cover the prevalence of literacy difficulties. We're going to hopefully demystify dyslexia, and we're going to look at what works for developing literacy skills, and there'll be lots of practical tips for the classroom. It's not within the scope of this session to look at specific targeted interventions for dyslexia and literacy difficulties, but rather we will be focusing on quality first teaching and making the learning accessible for pupils with literacy difficulties. So just to start off with, before we talk about the prevalence of literacy difficulties, just want to touch upon the fact that English as a language makes no sense. So English is an incredibly difficult language to learn to read and write because of its orthography, which is the way that sounds map onto the visual symbols of a language. There are some languages where there are very few rules and they tend to be very reliable in how you pronounce the given sound for a letter or combination of letters. So examples of those kind of languages would be things like Spanish, Italian, and Finnish. However, because our language has been influenced by so many other languages, we have what is called a deep orthography or an opaque orthography, which means that there are lots of rules, they are not very reliable, and we have a very high percentage of multi-letter rules. So we have 44 sounds that can be written 1,100 different ways, and only approximately 50% of English words are regular. And just a good example of that is the CH. So for example, CH can be pronounced as the ch in chip, k in chaos, sh in chef, and oh in yacht. This has a huge impact on children who are learning to read and write in English. So interestingly, the incidence of reported dyslexia and literacy difficulties varies widely by country, with Italy, for example, where they have a shallow orthography, having only half the incidence of dyslexia or literacy difficulties found in the United States. The prevalence of literacy difficulties in the UK have been estimated to be around 1 in 5 children. We know from the research that literacy difficulties have huge implications for health, mental well-being and future prospects. For example, according to the Literacy Trust, 60% of the prison population in the UK have difficulties with literacy. They've also found that the children who are the least engaged with literacy are twice as likely to have low levels of mental well-being than their peers, who are the most engaged, with over 37% of the least engaged children also reporting low levels of well-being. You may be watching this with other school staff, in which case you might like to pause the video for a moment to discuss these questions. Otherwise, perhaps pause the video and just take a few minutes to reflect on what you think in response to these questions. Hopefully, over the course of the next few slides, we'll explain the answers to those 2 questions. So dyslexia has become quite a controversial area in recent decades because of the difficulties coming to an agreement over a definition for dyslexia and the criteria by which it can be diagnosed in a scientific and objective manner. Many of the theories and models used to try to explain dyslexia have been disputed, meaning that at this point, all that is really agreed upon is that dyslexia is a term that can be used to describe children who experience problems learning to read and write. Many therefore use the terms dyslexia and literacy difficulties interchangeably. So what does the research suggest about dyslexia? It tells us that it's a difficulty achieving accurate and/or fluent reading and/or spelling at the word level. It occurs on a continuum where there's no clear cut-off between a child with literacy difficulties and a child who would have dyslexia or a diagnosis of dyslexia. Often, dyslexia includes difficulties with phonological skills, however, that isn't always the case. Children with dyslexia or literacy difficulties may also have working memory difficulties and slower verbal processing. However, it's thought that actually rather than that being anything that's causal in terms of dyslexia or literacy difficulties, it's more of a byproduct. And finally, it's agreed that there is some kind of genetic or neurobiological component, and you can see that in the way that dyslexia or literacy difficulties often runs in families. There are some big issues with diagnosis of dyslexia, and these are behind the decision of many local authorities and psychologists to no longer use the label to describe those with significant difficulties with literacy. I'm going to try and explain some of those issues now. So firstly, there is no agreed scientific criteria for diagnosis and no assessments that can be used to distinguish between a child who's struggling with their reading and one who's dyslexic. Rather, where children are given a diagnosis, it's based upon a judgment of their performance on a variety of assessments. But this means that many argue that it lacks objectivity and makes it very difficult for most professionals to be really confident that they're making an accurate judgment. To add to this, those diagnosed with dyslexia often have very different needs. For example, some will have visual disturbances while others won't. Some have working memory issues while others don't, and even difficulties with phonological skills are not seen in every child with significant literacy difficulties. Another issue with the label is that it can create a wait to fail situation if intervention and support is contingent upon being given a diagnosis. A further issue is that because most local authorities no longer use the label, it's usually one that must be paid for through a private assessment. These usually cost between £400 and £600, and we just cannot have a system where support is only given to those children whose families can provide such assessments and afford to do so. It's also the case that more than half of the 13 specialist dyslexia schools in the UK are based in London or Surrey, the two wealthiest counties. Unsurprisingly, none of those specialist schools are based in the 10 most impoverished counties in the UK, further compounding the social justice issue that has arisen regarding dyslexia. For some children and adults with dyslexia, the label can be really empowering. It can provide them with a way of understanding their difficulties and raising their self-esteem. However, recent research using the Millennium Cohort showed that those children labelled with dyslexia actually held lower beliefs about their ability in English and maths than their matched peers without the label. The children labelled with dyslexia were also significantly less likely to say that they would go to university, and furthermore, teachers and parents held lower aspirations for the children labelled with dyslexia. The label of dyslexia can also reduce teacher confidence. So research by Elliott and Gibbs showed that teachers feel really confident about supporting literacy difficulties, but much less so with dyslexia, which is unsurprising given that there is not even a consensus around what the term actually means. And finally, research suggests that there are no differences in terms of the interventions that would be effective whether the child has a diagnosis or not. So hopefully that gives you an answer to the question that was on the slide before. And so it is for all of these reasons that the stance within the Xavier Catholic Education Trust and in most local authorities across the UK is as such. Children need to be identified early if they have literacy difficulties, so we need to be assessing them within schools and monitoring their literacy difficulties, and we need to be finding them really, really early and intervening. We need to look at each child as an individual and understand their individual literacy needs. And this is where there can be a real problem with that label of dyslexia, because that can mean so many different things. It doesn't actually tell you whether the child has difficulties with their phonological skills, their working memory, their spelling, their reading. So actually we need to do assessments within schools to really have a look at what are the skills that they need support with, and then putting that intervention in place for that individual. And finally, all children who have literacy difficulties will be given support that they need, and this does not depend on diagnosis. And this relates to classroom support, interventions, but also exam concessions, because all of those are assessed on the basis of reading accuracy and fluency and comprehension, writing speed, processing speed, and not on the basis of a diagnosis itself. And all of those necessary assessments can be done within schools. Next, we're going to focus on how to support children with literacy difficulties in the classroom. So the response to intervention model is key to supporting children with literacy difficulties. The majority of pupils can be supported through making adjustments within the classroom to ensure that the work is accessible, and through quality first teaching that uses strategies shown by the evidence base to accelerate progress. Universal screening is also a strategy that can be used to assess all children for their literacy and language skills at key points throughout their schooling to ensure that needs are being identified early and supported. Progress should be continually monitored and further support implemented quickly for children who aren't making expected progress through targeted support. This targeted support are usually evidence-based interventions, usually within a small group, that are used to target skills that children are struggling with, for example, phonological skills, and accelerate progress in this area. So these interventions should be run little and often, at least 3 times per week. For the very small number of pupils who continue to not make expected progress, even with this targeted support, that would take the support up to Tier 3. And the first thing to do at this point is to make sure that the intervention is being run correctly and with fidelity to how the programme should be run. If that is the case, it may be that the intervention needs to be adapted to allow it to be effective for that pupil. For example, focusing on fewer sounds or fewer words, reducing the number of pupils in the group, or increasing the frequency of the intervention. We are going to spend the rest of this session looking at quality first teaching and making the learning accessible for learners who have difficulties with reading and writing. To begin with, it's important to start by saying that there are not lots of different ways to learn to read. So according to Dehane, it's simply not true that there are hundreds of ways to learn to read. Every child is unique, but when it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints and the same learning sequence. This means that there are approaches shown by the research as being the most effective ways to teach children to read. And whilst there might need to be some adjustments and interventions in line with the response to intervention model that we just talked about, the approaches that have been shown to really accelerate progress in reading are the same for children with dyslexia as they would be for children with literacy difficulties, and those same strategies also accelerate progress for children without literacy difficulties. So what has been shown by the evidence to accelerate progress in literacy? The response to intervention model that was discussed previously was one of the top factors in Hattie's visible learning meta-analysis that accelerates progress. The next one, distributed practice, means short, frequent teaching sessions that incorporate practice of identified skills, as this helps to address any retention and memory difficulties that we know are often linked with difficulties with literacy. We know from the research that the more often that children and young people practice remembering a skill, the more likely it is to be mastered. Interleaving, mixing the old learning with the new to minimise forgetting. Teaching of skills to fluency as well as accuracy, so by ensuring that there are sufficient opportunities for children and young people to practice and master skills before moving on. Fluency is crucial in also facilitating comprehension. This brings us nicely along to the next box of teaching comprehension alongside decoding. So you may recall learning about Scarborough's reading rope during training sessions that you've had on reading, where the threads of decoding and comprehension are woven together and developed together. So they both need to be taught as separate but related skills. For example, a pupil who has difficulty decoding can still benefit from comprehension activities using audiobooks, for example, to develop those skills. The INSET sessions on oracy highlight the huge importance of vocabulary, and vocabulary is a big factor in reading, in being able to predict what words say and self-correct based upon understanding of vocabulary. This is one of the reasons why it's important to expose children to other books aside from the easily decodable text in reading schemes, because this will expose them to a wider vocabulary. The research shows that the depth of vocabulary is as important as the breadth, so teaching them different words with similar meanings is as important as knowing lots of different words for different things. Systematic phonics teaching is recommended as being a key part of how we teach all children to read. Whilst the approach in the UK favours synthetic phonics, much of the research suggests that analytic or synthetic phonics are both really effective. There's also been a lot of research looking at what has been called the reading wars, of whether phonics are best or a whole word approach is best. The reading framework from the DFE, published last year, suggests that schools should use a phonics approach first and foremost. However, interestingly, actually the research seems to favour a more balanced approach that draws on whole word strategies too, and that's particularly helpful for children who struggle with phonics, because the first 100 most common words account for over 50% of written English, and the first 16 words account for the first 25% of words in written English. So by teaching these alongside phonics, it can really increase their access to written texts. Finally, motivation and engagement with reading is a significant predictor of achievement in reading, so we really need to support the emotional factors in reading, particularly for those who are struggling. And that final point really links to this analogy. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So clearly reading and writing are so key to all learning that happens in schools. So we need to make sure that where children are struggling with these skills, they are also able to still demonstrate their talents, knowledge and skills. Our challenge is how we make the classrooms and learning more accessible so that the children in our classes don't feel like this fish. So 3 top tips to take away from this session are the 3 A's. Assess, ask and adapt. So assess frequently to identify areas that require further targeted support. These assessments typically measure phonological awareness, reading accuracy, reading fluency, reading comprehension, spelling and writing, and help the teacher to identify the specific areas of literacy that require improvement. Ask relates to asking the child or young person what they find difficult and what helps them, because it will be different for different children. And finally, adapt. So make adaptation to the quality first teaching to ensure that pupils with literacy needs are able to access the learning. So depending on your observations and assessments, you should be able to identify the areas that the child finds difficult, and this diagram gives ideas for the kinds of strategies that the child might find helpful. The diagram might also provide a useful framework for your discussions with the young person about what adjustments they might find helpful. There are 8 areas altogether, with the first 4 displayed on this page, and I'll show you the next ones on the next slide. So the 4 areas on this diagram are emotional support, working memory, processing and recording work. We know that lots of children with literacy needs have difficulties with their working memory and processing, hence their inclusion on here. You may find it useful to pause the video for a few minutes to have a look at some of the suggested strategies and make notes of ones that you feel could be useful for pupils in your class who might be struggling. The second part of this diagram covers another 4 areas of possible need: vocabulary, the importance of which we've already discussed, how you present information to the children, reading and writing. It's important to mention that within the presentation section there are strategies such as changing the colour of the background on your board. Coloured overlays, coloured lenses and visual exercises are some of the best known interventions for children with literacy difficulties. However, there is not a conclusive evidence base for the use of these in supporting reading skills. However, this is where it's really important to ask the pupils what they need, because anecdotally, some pupils do find these helpful. This poster is available for you to use or display in your classroom for reference. Your SENGO has a copy that they can send to you, or you can contact me directly for one. You may like to pause the webinar again at this point to read through some of the other suggestions and think about adjustments that could be made for the pupils in your class. To finish, here are the references that I referred to earlier if you wanted to do any further reading around this area. I hope that this session has been helpful, and thank you very much for listening.